Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. Today, we're diving into a truly groundbreaking book by the late historian William McNeill called Plagues and Peoples. It was published in 1976, but it's still a landmark in explaining the historical importance of humanity's dynamic relationship with disease. But first, thanks to everyone who supports this podcast through Patreon and PayPal. If you want to get bonus content, just go to patreon.com/context, and for as little as $1 an episode, you're in. I do find Patreon to be the best platform for support. I like how you only pay when I post content, how we can easily interact through Patreon and exchange messages about the episodes, and Patreon even has an app that you can download on your smartphone to access the content more conveniently. So if you've never tried Patreon, if you're unfamiliar with it, I encourage you to check it out. It's all very well designed. I have set up an alternative way for you to support the show using PayPal in case you don't want to use Patreon for some reason, and the website, bradharris.com, will show you the way. Thanks again. And now, for Plagues and Peoples by William McNeill. We finished our last episode on this podcast acknowledging that, of all the historical challenges that have undermined humanity's control over its own fate, disease has been near the top of the list. As we've seen on this show, there is a tension among historians about what determines history, about the extent to which people can direct their own destinies amid the chaos of time. The history of disease manifests this tension well. Humanity has been at the mercy of disease forever. Plagues have destroyed entire civilizations. But through custom, science, and medicine, we've learned so much about disease in recent centuries that its threat has faded somewhat from modern life. Another way to say this might be that while disease used to be perhaps the most important historical factor in the success or failure of societies, it no longer is. Our fight against disease carries on. We know that epidemics can strike at any time. We know that microorganisms have the capacity to evolve faster than our defenses. But the mass death that disease long delivered, the utter helplessness it reduced us to, has receded before the advance of science and administrative cooperation. So, the story of disease demonstrates both the accidental nature of history, forces beyond our control that capriciously devastate some and advantage others, and the triumph of human reason that can enable us to gain some control over our fate. In this case, so that most of us no longer suffer the death of half our children, among other nightmares. William McNeill's book, Plagues and Peoples, was the first comprehensive history to capture this balance, and after more than 40 years, it remains one of the most insightful narratives on how disease has both shaped and been shaped by civilization. William McNeill, who passed away in 2016 at the age of 98, was a highly decorated historian. Among his many accolades, he won the U.S. National Book Award, the Erasmus Prize, the National Humanities Medal, and he served as the president of the American Historical Association, all in addition to being one of the most popular professors of history at the University of Chicago, where he taught for 40 years between 1947 and 1987. This guy was an exceptionally compelling thinker. I wish I'd had a chance to meet him. Now, like the author Charles Mann, who we talked with last time, McNeill was convinced that contact and exchange between societies was the most important factor shaping human history. And yet, one of the most critical consequences of contact between civilizations, transmission of disease, was almost entirely lacking from the historical scholarship he surveyed. Through the mid-20th century, historians wrote endlessly about war and politics, technology and economics, but no one, so far as McNeill could tell, was investigating the role of pestilence in the rise and fall of empires. Rome's collapse through the 400s, for example, had been the subject of professional study for well over 1,000 years. But amid all of the arguments about how corruption, war, and political chaos brought Rome down, very little had ever been written about what killed more Romans than anything else: disease. A smallpox epidemic tore through the empire between 165 and 180 AD, and that, combined with another plague that struck in the year 251, killed around half of the empire's entire population. To McNeill, this, obviously, is what made Rome's collapse inevitable. McNeill stewed on this idea for a number of years, and when he confronted an even more blatant historical oversight, he decided it was time to write Plagues and Peoples. Quote, "I was reading about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. As everyone knows, Hernando Cortés, starting off with fewer than 600 men, conquered the Aztec Empire, whose subjects numbered millions. How could such a tiny handful prevail? All the familiar explanations seemed inadequate. If Montezuma and his friends first thought the Spaniards were gods, experience soon showed otherwise. If horses and gunpowder were amazing and terrible on first encounter, armed clashes soon revealed the limitations of horse flesh and the very primitive guns the Spaniards had at their disposal. So what about the epidemic of smallpox that broke out among the Aztecs? No one knew how to respond or what to do. Something like a third of them died from the initial onslaught. Moreover, it's worth considering the psychological implications of a disease that killed only Aztecs and left the Spaniards unharmed. Such partiality could only be explained supernaturally. The religions, priesthoods, and way of life built around the old Native American gods could not have survived such a demonstration. Little wonder, then, that Native Americans accepted Christianity and submitted to Spanish control so meekly. The lopsided impact of infectious disease upon Native American populations therefore offered a key to understanding the ease of the Spanish conquest of America, not only militarily, but culturally as well." End quote. We saw much of the same argument reiterated in Jared Diamond's Pulitzer Prize-winning book from 1997, Guns, Germs, and Steel. But when McNeill himself had first pondered this idea some 30 years earlier, it was a pretty novel revelation. McNeill was the pioneer. Diamond's work, in fact, drew heavily on McNeill's, but whereas Jared Diamond focused exclusively on how environmental factors like germs determined the fates of human societies, McNeill saw how the relationship operated both ways, how the development of human societies likewise determined the fates of microorganisms. McNeill actually criticized Guns, Germs, and Steel when it came out for being too environmentally deterministic. For in his own book, Plagues and Peoples, he had shown how the evolution of disease and civilization was reciprocal. Plagues and Peoples is not a terribly long read. It only runs about 360 pages. But within that space, McNeill managed to survey almost the entire history of the epidemiological consequences of human development. Overhunting of big game in the Stone Age is where his story starts, since the extermination of so many animals between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago is what forced humanity to develop agriculture in the first place. And this, in turn, caused our ancestors to enter into a radically new relationship with pathogens. Learning how to plant crops and tend livestock got our ancestors out of the jam they'd created for themselves by securing new sources of calories. But as McNeill pointed out, quote, "There was another side to the agricultural distortion of natural ecological balances. Shortening the food chain and multiplying a restricted number of domesticated species of plants and animals also created dense concentrations of potential food for parasites." End quote. The establishment of civilization, in other words, also established epidemic disease as we know it. Prior to the agricultural revolution around 12,000 years ago, our hunting and gathering lifestyle was much less conducive to epidemics. Our ancestors were more isolated, constantly on the move, and they obtained their food from a wide variety of plants and animals. The origin of civilization followed from agriculture because planting crops and tending livestock allowed tribes to settle down in one place permanently, grow their sedentary populations, and build more complex communities. Yet, civilization came with a cost. McNeill wrote, quote, "Settling down involved new risks of parasitic infection, increased contact with human feces as they accumulated in proximity to living quarters, for instance, could allow a wide variety of intestinal parasites to move safely from host to host. By contrast, a hunting band perpetually on the move would risk little from this kind of infectious cycle. Other parasitic organisms must have found it easy to move from host to host via contaminated water supplies. This, too, was far more likely to happen when human communities remained in one location permanently and had to rely on the same water sources for all household needs year in and year out." End quote. Irrigation in particular, critical to the establishment of all civilizations, was like a superhighway of waterborne disease transmission. Not only this, in addition to worms and other multicellular parasites that thrived in warm, shallow irrigation networks, bacteria and viruses native to herding animals like horses, sheep, goats, and pigs likewise prospered as early pastoralists concentrated these animals into small enclosures. Unnatural crowding quickened transmission between animals and ultimately from them to people. Quote, "Many of our common infectious diseases have recognizable affinities with one or another disease afflicting domesticated animals. Measles, for example, is probably related to rinderpest or canine distemper. Smallpox is certainly connected closely with cowpox and a cluster of other animal infections. Influenza is shared by humans and hogs." End quote. Reservoirs of disease grew rapidly along with human and domesticated animal populations. And here's the key. Once humanity's earliest villages and city-states contained a few thousand people or more, which first occurred between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago across Eurasia, a critical epidemiological threshold was crossed, and humanity's relationship with disease would never be the same. Among tribes of hunter-gatherers whose members were relatively spread out and numbering in the hundreds, any infectious disease contracted by a tribal member from a wild animal host, like a felled deer or a mosquito or tick or something, rarely spread beyond that person and his or her immediate kin. So diseases typically burned themselves out quickly by either killing their human hosts or conferring immunity. Further spread was usually only possible if other members of the tribe encountered the same environmental source of infection, which was also less likely given hunter-gatherers' frequent migration. Hunter-gatherers, it turns out, rarely got sick. In contrast, among thousands of people living densely together in the world's first villages and city-states, infectious bacteria and viruses spread widely enough to become endemic, which is to say that these infections began to linger permanently among at least some portion of the population, and usually this portion was children. Every child represented a fresh human host, preserving the necessary chain of infectious spread in the population even after each individual child died or became immune. Endemic childhood diseases, McNeill highlighted, were, quote, "the peculiar hallmark and epidemiological burden of cities and of countrysides in contact with cities. They are familiar to almost all contemporary humankind as the ordinary diseases of childhood: measles, mumps, whooping cough, smallpox, and the rest." End quote. Thus, with the birth of civilization came a new, golden age for infectious disease. Domesticated animals living closely with us for the first time certainly represented a major new source of pestilence, but wild environmental sources of bacteria and viruses still threatened us. Bubonic plague originated with rodents, for example. Yellow fever came from monkeys, and rabies was born among bats. The key change was that whenever a person contracted an infectious illness, no matter where it came from, all of the irrigation networks, shared municipal water, waste contamination, crowding, and commerce that defined human civilization provided a massively upgraded environment for infectious disease to flourish before settling in among children. Seldom in its evolutionary history had infectious disease found such a profitable ecological niche. Yet, part of what made Plagues and Peoples so groundbreaking was how McNeill emphasized the manner in which diseases also, ironically, made civilization so much more powerful than non-settled tribal society. Quote, "A suitably diseased society in which endemic forms of viral and bacterial infection continually provoke antibody formation by invading susceptible individuals unceasingly is vastly more formidable from an epidemiological point of view vis-a-vis simpler and healthier human societies." End quote. Civilized societies became much more powerful than tribal societies, not only politically and militarily then, but biologically as well. We might even venture to say that the evolution of civilization and infectious disease proceeded symbiotically. Forced to coexist with pestilence, many city-states as far back as the Bronze Age, between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, were already beginning to manage disease through everything from large-scale water engineering to new religious practices. Cities drained swamps where malaria-bearing mosquitoes swarmed. They dug primitive sewers to separate waste and irrigation from drinking water. Around the Mediterranean, at least, these projects drastically cut down on the incidence of malaria, cholera, cryptosporidium, typhoid, dysentery, and a host of other maladies. Meanwhile, custom and religious beliefs regarding diet and sanitation developed that clearly reflected centuries' worth of trial and error with disease mitigation. The Jewish and later Muslim proscriptions against pork, for example, become easier to understand, McNeill argued, when, quote, "one realizes that hogs were scavengers in Near Eastern villages, quite capable of eating contaminated waste. If then eaten by people without the most thorough cooking, their flesh was easily capable of transferring a number of parasites to human beings, as modern encounters with trichinosis attest." End quote. Such cultural adaptations to disease management helped enable Bronze and later Iron Age civilizations to grow tremendously in population and complexity. Interestingly, however, within these burgeoning empires, the city centers themselves were simply too crowded, dirty, and therefore disease-ridden to maintain their population growth without massive inflows of immigrants from the countryside. The empires as a whole expanded and prospered as long as the political, commercial, and military benefits deriving from the cities reverberated back out to the countrysides that supplied the cities food and people. Despite the impressive growth of their cities, up until around 2,000 years ago, the world's major civilizations remained only regional empires. None achieved sustained contact with others beyond a couple thousand miles. Even at its height, the Roman Empire, for example, never recorded more than fleeting encounters with anyone from China. And so, although each civilization's population tended to adapt well to disease culturally and immunologically, those adaptations were only in response to the diseases in their own regions, or what McNeill called their own disease pools. This left them more and more vulnerable as their populations grew into the millions. Historians' best estimates of the population of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago is around 54 million, which is only slightly lower than the estimate for China's population at that time under the Han Dynasty, probably around 60 million. At that scale, contamination between the two disease pools grew almost inevitable, in McNeill's estimation. And when it finally came, its consequences produced the first truly catastrophic pandemics in history. It was commerce that brought the ancient empires down. Exchange of goods involved exchange of germs. By around 2,000 years ago, trade between the growing civilizational centers of the Mediterranean, India, and China had slowly emerged. The very first threads of what would one day become the Silk Road were woven as overland caravans kept extending their range. Oceanic trade had likewise grown generation after generation with advancements in boat building and sailing technology. Ultimately, quote, beginning in the 1st century A.D., travel across the breadth of the Old World from China and India to the Mediterranean became regularly organized, and conditions for the diffusion of infections among the separate civilizations of the Old World altered profoundly. The possibility of homogenization of those infections, whose most critical limit was defined by the number of new human hosts available day in, day out, opened up. And there is reason to suppose that before the end of the 2nd century A.D., epidemic disasters in fact struck severe blows to Mediterranean populations, and probably afflicted the population of China as well. End quote. Eurasia's separate disease pools began to blend. A wave of global pandemics resulted. McNeill, writing in the 1970s, admitted that his access to Chinese records was slim, but Roman records, at least, clearly indicated that the city's long experience with epidemics prior to contact with China, quote, paled before the disease that began spreading through the Roman Empire in 165 AD after commercial contact. Probably as much as a quarter to a third of the empire's entire population died. What mattered even more was the fact that this episode inaugurated a process of continued decay of the population of Mediterranean lands that lasted, despite some local recoveries, for more than half a millennium. End quote. Although it's difficult to determine the exact pathogen behind this first disaster, McNeill supposed that it was a novel variety of measles or smallpox that arrived in Western Eurasia from China. Whatever it was, another round of it tore through Rome again between the years 251 and 266, killing an estimated 5,000 people every single day at the height of the pandemic in the city of Rome alone. Given that Rome's final collapse occurred within the next century, these plagues surely played a major role in bringing down the empire. Leaving half of its population dead, at least 25 million people, the entire machinery of Roman civilization fell apart. Tax revenue plummeted and food cultivation ceased, causing further anarchy and famine that left Rome almost totally vulnerable to barbarian invasion and civil war. But as McNeill said, this was only the beginning of more than half a millennium of infectious assault, which plunged the West into the Dark Ages. What happened there was akin to what would happen 1,000 years later in the New World, when tens of millions of Native Americans were likewise wiped out by exposure to unfamiliar diseases. The Mediterranean basin was again ravaged by an even worse 200-year-long plague between the year 542 and 750, the so-called Plague of Justinian, killing another 25 to 50 million people, this time with some 10,000 people dying every day for at least 4 months straight in the city of Constantinople at the plague's peak. That's over 1 million corpses in 4 months. That's too many people to even bury. That's too many people to burn. The entire city reeked of death for years. If you want to know what apocalypse looks like, I can't think of a better place to look than Constantinople in the late 500s. There's better evidence about the source of this outbreak. Researchers have determined that it was actually bubonic plague, caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria that originated with the arrival of black rat fleas from India, which probably infested merchants doing business between India and Egypt. Once in Egypt, these fleas carried bubonic plague all over the Mediterranean. Events like these were so disruptive that we would be shocked if they didn't cause major historical shifts. McNeill pointed out, for example, that the explosive spread of Islam in the 600s was directly related to the West's demise from disease. Quote, "The failure of Roman and Persian forces to offer more than token resistance to the Muslim armies that swarmed out of Arabia so suddenly in 634 becomes easier to understand in light of the demographic disasters that repeatedly visited the Mediterranean coastlands from 542 onward. More generally, the perceptible shift away from the Mediterranean as the preeminent center of Western civilization was powerfully assisted by the long series of plagues, which confined their ravages almost entirely to territories within easy reach of Mediterranean ports." End quote. Still, after the initial shock of exposure to novel diseases waned, as affected populations died off or became immune, societies typically recovered quickly, and pandemics faded once more into the more stable pattern of endemic childhood disease, or what McNeill called a coexistence between host and parasite. Quote, "This process of epidemiological adjustment was energetically underway in Europe as a whole during the so-called Dark Ages. As a result, the crippling demographic consequences of exposure to unfamiliar diseases disappeared within a few centuries." End quote. So, not only can we consider the fall of Rome and the ensuing Dark Ages of Western civilization to have been largely caused by exposure to new diseases, but Europe's recovery and eventual renaissance can likewise be understood largely as the product of European societies' immunological and cultural adaptations to those diseases. There's good historical evidence to suggest that the same dynamic played itself out in China between the rule of the Han Dynasty and the Sung Dynasty. By around the year 1000, then, European and Chinese societies appear to have adjusted well to the biological blending of regional disease pools that had occurred across Eurasia as a result of long-distance commerce. Populations on both sides of Eurasia had stabilized and were beginning to grow quickly once again. Only part of this adjustment was immunological, though, McNeill highlighted. Much of Europe's and China's recovery resulted from cultural adjustments featuring a resurgence of isolationism and xenophobia, especially among the Chinese. Trade and migration were restricted, walls were built, foreign people, goods, and customs were increasingly regarded with hostility. It's strange to realize that 2,000 years ago, the Romans and Chinese were generally far more cosmopolitan, curious, and open to novelty than their descendants 1,000 years later had become. But this new form of medieval provincialism, this narrowing of taste and curtailment of curiosity, actually seemed to work. At least some sense of stability and control did re-emerge, and that must have seemed desirable even though it came at the expense of cosmopolitanism and commercial prosperity. China and Europe settled back into their own private worlds for the next few centuries, and life seemed normal again, at least for a time. But as the generations rolled by, their disease pools too became isolated once more, and their immunological resistance narrowed accordingly. Tragically then, as history would show, by trying to adapt to the pandemic catastrophe of one age, European and Chinese societies only made themselves vulnerable to the catastrophe of another. Through the 1300s, the Mongolian Empire under Genghis Khan ripped open the isolated worlds of Eastern and Western Eurasia. No need to get bogged down reiterating that history here. We explored the Mongolian Empire's extraordinary expansion in a prior episode on this podcast, in consideration of Jack Weatherford's book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Suffice it to say that the Mongolian Empire forced most of the societies of Eurasia to reconnect, first commercially, then epidemiologically. And given the Mongols' own origins in northern Eurasia, they also integrated entirely new environmental sources of disease into the re-established global network. Quote, "Not only did large numbers of persons travel very long distances across cultural and epidemiological frontiers, they also traversed a more northerly route than had ever been intensively traveled before. The ancient Silk Road between China and Syria crossed the deserts of Central Asia, passing from oasis to oasis. Now, in addition to this old route, caravans, soldiers, and postal riders rode across the open grasslands. From an epidemiological point of view, this northward extension of the caravan trade network had one very significant consequence. Wild rodents of the Mongolian steppelands introduced new diseases, among them, in all probability, a new wave of bubonic plague." End quote. Europe and China had suffered the consequences of Yersinia pestis bacterial infections over 700 years earlier. So by the 1300s, immunity had almost completely faded from each civilization's population. A new plague erupted from Beijing to London. The Black Death, as it's commonly called, had begun. In China, the Black Death of the early to mid-1300s killed half the population, nearly 60 million people, according to historians' best estimates. Mongolian invasion, occupation, and a subsequent Chinese civil war only made things worse. The plague reached the shores of the Black Sea in Eastern Europe by the 1340s, where regional trading networks quickly dispatched it to the rest of Europe by the early 1350s. The propagation of the Black Death was so rapid because it appears to have occurred both by the conventional animal vector of flea bites and directly between people from physical contact with bubonic pustules, and even more pervasively from inhalation of bacilli-infected droplets coughed or sneezed out of infected individuals. Quote, "Die-offs varied widely. Some communities experienced total extinction. Others, like Milan, Italy, seem to have escaped entirely. Overall, the best estimate for Europe as a whole is that about 1/3 of the total population died initially. But the plague did not disappear after this first massive attack. Instead, recurrent plagues followed at irregular intervals, and places that had escaped the first onset commonly experienced severe die-off in later epidemics." End quote. After a few decades, half of Europe's population had probably died too. And as in China, the consequences were dramatic. The entire socio-economic structure of Europe was upended. For some survivors, however, the plague proved to be a good thing, which is one of the most fascinating parts of the history and one of the most poignant examples of human resilience. Wages rose across Europe as labor became scarcer, and economic mobility increased as huge numbers of merchants, officials, and aristocrats died, opening the way for enterprising newcomers. Plague cracked apart the calcified Europe of the medieval era, securing feudalism's collapse and thereby creating the opportunity for the Renaissance and Europe's more general economic, commercial, and philosophical awakening of the late 1400s. And crucially, once cultural and immunological adaptations empowered Europeans to overcome this latest epidemic, they became more epidemiologically formidable than ever. Just in time for the age of oceanic exploration, after some 1,500 years of repeated exposure to Eurasian disease, catastrophic die-off, and hard-earned recovery, adult Europeans were left generally immune to most of the prevalent infectious diseases on Earth, and they would, of course, inadvertently carry this arsenal of microorganisms with them across the oceans of the world. 1,500 years worth of suffering and death, in other words, was about to be imposed on Native Americans within the span of decades. In two other books we've discussed on this podcast, Guns, Germs, and Steel and 1493, we explored the details of the Native American apocalypse that followed European contact. In the 1960s, when McNeill himself first tried to understand that horribly lopsided history, no one had adequately explained how tens of millions of Native Americans could be overwhelmed by thousands of Europeans. McNeill achieved that insight by introducing the historical primacy of disease, and in so doing, he established a rich legacy of scholarship that continues to enhance our understanding of how Eurasian germs equipped Europeans with their most powerful weapon in the struggle for global influence. In fact, in my recent conversation with Charles Mann, author of 1493, he went so far as to suggest that the title of Jared Diamond's book be changed from Guns, Germs, and Steel to Germs, Germs, and Germs. It's an understandable fixation in justifying Europe's otherwise unlikely success in the Americas. But McNeill clarified broader historical patterns in the relationship between plagues and peoples that such a fixation risks overlooking, including Europeans' unrivaled efforts to understand and better control disease and to spread that knowledge around the world. Public health measures became much more coordinated in cities from Italy to England as far back as the 1400s in response to the Black Death, with quarantine being among the most effective early efforts. Folk beliefs that wool carried plague were taken seriously, leading to the first professional publications that fleas, often found in woolen textiles, might have some role in the pandemic. As McNeill summarized, quote, "With every fundamental of medicine thus called into question, the only logical recourse was to observe results of cures administered, compare theories, and then choose whichever worked better. The swift development of European medical practice to levels of skill exceeding all other civilized traditions resulted." End quote. This degree of rational inquiry so far back in history was exceptional. McNeill even documented that as early as 1700, Europeans began to investigate inoculation after receiving reports from East India Company merchants that the Chinese royal family was experimenting with the practice. The Royal Society, England's premier scientific establishment, conducted a groundbreaking statistical study of inoculation between 1721 and 1740 that proved inoculation's effectiveness. But even more impressively, the Society spent significant sums educating medical practitioners around the world on how to implement it. Quote, "The spectacular upshot was the discovery and acceptance of vaccination within less than a century. Even more spectacular was the speed with which the technique of vaccination spread throughout the world on the strength of the existing European medical communications network. Thus, for example, a doctor in backwoods Kentucky had vaccinated some 500 persons in the small town of Lexington by 1803. Russian doctors began vaccinating Siberian natives on the Chinese border in 1805. And in the same year, a Portuguese merchant in Macau brought vaccine from the Philippines to meet the crisis of a large-scale outbreak of smallpox in South China." End quote. London had been one of the most diseased cities in the world in 1700, but it became one of the most disease-free by 1850. And British urban planners likewise ventured around the world to help other cities implement the new standards of sanitation, along with epidemiological safeguards pioneered by the English physician John Snow. In 1883, when a cholera epidemic broke out in Egypt, a consortium of European doctors rushed to the scene, led by the German Robert Koch, and, quote, "The result was spectacular. Within a few weeks, the team announced that it had discovered the bacillus causing cholera, thereby giving enormous new impetus to Pasteur's germ theory of disease." End quote. Plagues and Peoples concludes, therefore, not only with a sense of redemption for Europeans, but also a restored sense of agency for humanity as a whole. After more than 5,000 years of helplessly suffering and spreading the most lethal consequence of civilization, we finally learned how to dramatically reduce the power of plagues to determine our destiny. In the 42 years since McNeill published the book, we've learned a great deal more about humanity's coevolution with microorganisms, and with each new facet of knowledge, we've become ever more capable of cooperating instead of competing with them. Next time on Context, we're going to pause in our investigation of other scholars' insights so I can share some of my own work on the fascinating history of how our understanding of that coevolution has progressed. I'm going to read a piece I published in the journal American Scientist in 2013, titled Evolution's Other Narrative. I'm Brad Harris. So long.